Your Excellency, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, what I think is going to be a very special evening. My name is Justin Wateridge, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of running Steps Travel. And we at Steps are delighted to be sponsoring this screening this evening. We have a team of experts who specialize in different parts of the world, whether it be a cultural tour in Rajasthan, a family holiday in South Africa, a Galapagos cruise, or a long weekend in Naples. They have great destination knowledge, but also knowledge of contacts. People are key in travel. It's about who you know, and it's about who you meet. And I'm delighted to say, before we have the screening, we're going to have a panel discussion. And certainly 3 of the panel have worked with and knew Norman Lewis very well. The 4th, who'll be chairing the panel, is the UK's best-known globetrotter, none other than Michael Palin. Now, Michael is an inspiration to all of us. I think his longevity is down to 3 reasons: his empathy, his laughter, and his unselfishness. And I think that these are traits that we would all do well to be mindful of in our own travels. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to introduce Michael Palin and his panel. Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening and welcome, as David Frost used to say. First of all, a little bit about the man whose work we're celebrating this evening. Norman Lewis was born in Enfield in 1908 and died after a life spent all over the globe back in Essex at Finchingfield near Saffron Walden in 2003. He was 95. He wrote a number of novels, pieces of journalism, and 12 travel books, widely acknowledged as classics of the genre, best known of which are A Dragon Apparent, Golden Earth, The Honoured Society, his study of the Mafia, and of course the book that has brought us all here tonight, Naples 44. Graham Greene called him one of the best writers, not of any particular decade, but of our century. Auberon Waugh called him the best travel writer since Marco Polo. Had he read them all? And even Will Self, rarely given to flights of hyperbole, described Lewis as one of the greatest 20th century writers. He's also one of the travel writers I most admire, largely for the clarity and precision of his writing and his ability to go into very dark and difficult places and to come out without sermonizing or romanticizing. And all of this is underscored by a sense of humor so dry as to be positively Saharan, which permeates and, as far as I'm concerned, enriches so much of his work. I've chosen a short passage from Naples 44, which I think shows all the elements of Norman at work. This is September the 1st. A single night in the stifling communal dormitory of the Hotel Vesuvio, under the attack of its very special breed of house mosquito, has been enough to break some Canadian spirits. And this morning, the 2 officers, a sergeant major and 4 sergeants, decided to move on to Avellino, where conditions were reported better. I was therefore left with the other sergeant major and 4 sergeants. They're friendly and cooperative, and in spite of their immorality, hard to dislike. They've absolutely nothing whatever to do with their time and hardly know what the war is about. As was to be expected, not one of them speaks a word of Italian. Today has been spent in getting to know the town. They give candy to every child in sight, shove all male Italians off the pavement, and make an instant sexual advance to every woman of childbearing age they encounter. These routine approaches are endured by the girls with great dignity. And some go to the lengths of making polite and even apologetic speeches explaining just why they feel unable to agree to have sexual intercourse on the spot. It also has what I love very much, an eye for eccentric detail. I mean, had it not been for Norman Lewis, I wouldn't have known that Ernest Hemingway, about whom I thought I knew everything, that Norman Hemingway actually drank Dubonnet. Can you believe that? Norman Lewis went to see him in 1959 and, I think, saw him drinking Dubonnet by the half pint. I mean, we all know he had mojitos and tequila and daiquiris and all that, but Dubonnet? Hemingway? I mean, my mother used to drink Dubonnet, for God's sake. And in his pajamas, yes, well, what other way? In A Goddess in the Stones, his book, Goddess in the Stones, I was interested to see that Norman Lewis had, like me, spent time in the rarely visited Indian state of Orissa, but only Norman could have found a hotel with a large sign above the entrance on which was written, "Piles will be cured in half an hour, without pain." Well, we can't make any similar claims tonight, but what I can promise you is that by the time that we see the film, we'll all be a little wiser about the author of Naples 44, as we have gathered three people who at various times in their lives have had very privileged access to a private man. John Hatt founded the incomparable Elan Books 35 years ago. It remains for me the quintessential travel publisher, now of course run by Barnaby Rogerson. It's 35 years old and has consistently kept Norman Lewis's work in print. Charlotte Moore is currently Director of Content at the BBC. She worked with Norman Lewis on a documentary in New Guinea and Indonesia in 1991. And Julian Evans, inveterate traveller, author of Transit of Venus, Travels in the Pacific, has written a superb biography of Lewis called Semi-Invisible Man. And I feel I should say at this stage that Don McCullen, the photographer, who worked on some of the great Sunday Times stories with Norman Lewis, was to have been here, was to have been part of the panel, but he's very, very sorry he's not been able to turn up. However, we have three experts. And I'll start, John, with you. How did you and Norman Lewis first come together?
Well, I can remember it well, is that when I started the publishing company, it seems amazing now, but very few bookshops had shelves for travel literature. That had sort of gone, it had become very unfashionable. And so I started Elan to reprint travel literature, and obviously I asked friends and acquaintances, and again the name Norman Lewis came up, and of course I fell immediately in love with this stuff. Anyway, I could vividly remember it because I asked him to lunch to meet him, and we had lunch just a hop and a skip from here in the Polish Club in Exhibition Road, and he wanted to go to the lavatory, and it was a rather rickety club then with rickety staircase, so I escorted him down to the lavatory, and opposite it was a fruit machine. And so while he went in to have a pee, I put some money into the fruit machine and did this. And after a while, the machine went and pounds started coming out. I'd hit a jackpot. And then there'd be another pause, and more pounds would come out. And finally, Norman came out of the lavatory and watched me, and even more pounds, and pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds came out. And it actually overflowed from the sort of vessel underneath. And Norman looked rather gloomy as he looked at this. He said, oh dear, he said. When I get home and I tell them this, he said, they're going to say, there you go, Norman, lying again. And if I can indulge in another quick anecdote on that to sort of slightly defend him, he did like things high colour like that. But some years later, I was in a remote forest in North Vietnam and in a remote rest house, and I was rereading A Dragon Apparent. And on a page there, Norman was in another remote forest in North Vietnam, and he describes this enormous moth coming in, and I can't remember which bird he's described, but let's call it a blackbird, something very, very big, flapping away. And I thought, Norman, I wish I'd been your editor and calmed you down on this. You know, people must believe you and things like this. And the only point of this story, if it's true, but I absolutely promise you this is true, at that very moment, whoomp through the window, came a great moth, much bigger than the blackbird, And in a rather sort of Norman Lewis typical aspect, the forest officer rushed over and killed it before I could do anything.
Was he an easy author to handle? Did he turn up in time? And did you have, was it sort of...
Oh, yes, he was completely professional in every way and totally modest and kind. He couldn't have been better to deal with.
Charlotte, you made a film with him, as I've said. And what were the circumstances in which this film came about?
So I was very early on in my days of television, and I was a production secretary sitting doing a series about the Royal Collection for Channel 4. And I got a call one day from my brother, saying, look, a call's gone out in the office if anyone knows anyone who speaks Indonesian. Now, this hadn't really come in great use to me ever before, but it turned out that I did speak Indonesian because I'd lived in Indonesia in my year out before going to university, and I travelled there quite a lot. And they said, there's this meeting at Channel 4 in 2 days' time. There's a travel writer called Norman Lewis, who I had heard about because he'd written a lot about missionaries and his outrage at sort of persecution of tribal peoples. And as I'd been living in Indonesia, I'd become very interested in this as well. And I thought, you mean I've got to come up with a film idea for Norman Lewis? They said, yes, you need to be at Channel 4 in 2 days' time. So I met Norman literally an hour before this meeting. I mean, I was a production secretary at the time, so I didn't really tell anyone that. I just said, yes, I speak Indonesian. And Norman...
Where did you meet? Was this
we
in
met,
neutral ground?
A company called Clark Productions. Bernard Clark had sort of set this meeting up and had promised Norman we'd make this film. So Norman said to me, so I met him and I was very excited, knowing that, he was the illustrious, amazing Norman Lewis.
What sort of presence was he? Did he sort of stride into the room?
So I'd sort of done lots of research on what this journey might be, and I really tried to think, well, this is my chance. I can leave the desk job and I might actually get to travel again. And I'd travelled quite a lot and I thought, this could be amazing. And Norman, his first words to me, Charlotte, if we're going to... I won't imitate, because you do Norman's voice brilliantly. But he leaned over very quietly, and it was always very intimate the way he would talk. He'd get, now, Charlotte, we haven't met, but would you be able to get me to the copper mine? And there was this big copper mine in West New Guinea. And, Norman, did he want to do television? I don't really know at that stage. I'm not sure he really did, but he really wanted to get to see this copper mine because he knew that the Indonesian government and a big New Orleans company, Freeport McMoran, were basically taking away whole mountains. And these mountains, Norman also knew, were the sacred places for tribal peoples who were basically living in a very Stone Age existence. And he knew, and he'd read about this, and he knew that these mountains would soon disappear. And, having been the man that set up what was the sort of instigator of Survival International, this was a big focus for Norman. And I realised very quickly that, yes, he was prepared to do this Traveller's Tales film for Channel 4, and they were amazed that, he was going to get one of the greatest travel writers who didn't really seek television and hadn't any sort of aspirations to be a presenter, but he really wanted to get to that copper mine. And I realised then that if I was going to do this journey, I had to get Norman to the copper mine.
Was his sense of indignation sort of palpable? Was it driving the thing all the time, or was he able to sort of look at other aspects of Indonesian life while you were doing it?
When we were actually there? Yes. I mean, Norman was... he was an extraordinary person to travel with because he never wanted... Whilst he was the centre of attention, we didn't... That was right. We didn't want the Indonesian government to realise he was the Norman Lewis. But fortunately, actually, Norman, Leslie, I know you're here, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but his name is actually John Norman Lewis. So we thought this was very clever because on his passport, we could just call him John Lewis. So he was made out to be, and Norman thought this was wonderful, that he could just be John Lewis. So we had to call him John quite a lot when any Indonesian officials were around. Yes, anyway, I'm not sure what the Indonesian government would make of this, but I'm sure they're not very well. And we managed to get him into the country as John Lewis, as this sort of, just tourist guide, really, is what he was. But of course, Norman never wanted to be the centre of attention. He always, even though he was the presenter and we were therefore just facilitating his journey, Norman would always just let everything else happen while he sat back and watched. And I think anyone who works with Norman realised that Norman wasn't a big ego in the room.
Well,
he always sort of held back.
This is an interesting aspect. I'm going to ask you, Julian, about this. Because I remember he wrote or said, I'm probably one of the few people who can actually enter a room and leave it, and nobody will know I've been there. Which we laugh at a bit, but quite important for him and his work. How I mean,
Yeah,
how important was his reticence?
Well, I think it was quite important for his enthusiasm because, as Charlotte says, he quite liked the sort of role of the spy. He quite liked to be the person who was getting the information that other people weren't getting. And he did do it. He worked for Ian Fleming when Ian Fleming was collecting information for MI6. But I think it was also very important to him as a character because he had this well, suburban doesn't really do it justice if you talk about his childhood. He lived in a suburb of a suburb, 40 Hill, outside Enfield. And there were a lot of fairly brutalized, newly industrialized people working at, in the local factories. Norman's dad was a pharmacist. Norman was very intelligent, and he got bullied like crazy. He was, and he hadn't...
Because he was intelligent.
Yeah. And he hadn't actually talked about it for 80 years, and then I interviewed him, and he suddenly said, I want to tell you about the winter when I was thrashed with sheets of ice, and I was so badly injured, I had to be wheeled home by a woman who was pushing her pram past, and she took pity on me. And so I think that gave him this sort of really abiding reticence, this and it wasn't just going into the room and then leaving and thinking, aha, nobody noticed me. He noticed everybody in the room and what they were doing.
But he realised the importance of observing rather than being...
I mean, he turned it into a virtue. I mean, I can't quite work... He was such a good storyteller, and I can't quite work out whether it was because when he was young and isolated, he sort of told himself stories to try and explain the world to himself, or whether life was just so boring that he told stories in order to make it more interesting. Probably a bit of both.
I don't know, Tristram Polet here. I think Tristram made a film for Arena about him. He tells the most wonderful story about a sex talk in school. Do you remember that? Just goes on about a strange machine. He said some of the boys, if they really wanted to know about, get this very strange master to say these describe things.
This wasn't at school. No, it was the illustrious Bowles family.
Oh, do tell the story.
Who were the sort of they were the sort of mafiosi or the capo di tutti capi of 40 Hill.
Oh, right.
and this chap Bowles, who was a fantastic botanist, actually. I think he was very interested in young boys in a way that scandalized.
Confirmed bachelor, they would say.
Confirmed bachelor. I mean, I don't think there was anything...
No.
No, I mean, I think in that sort of wonderful Edwardian way, there was absolutely nothing going on, but he was a confirmed bachelor who sort of sublimated whatever it was he was thinking and feeling into the sex talks that he gave to the village boys, and with a little machine which was powered by steam, and as the figures moved faster and faster, it eventually got to a point where there was a sort of whistle blowing as it reached its climax. Little steam-driven machine.
He told the...
He
tells the story so wonderfully. I felt I've got to get one of these machines. Yeah. I'll get back to you. What was it about? We're going to see the film tonight, which is the film of Naples 44. So should we talk a little bit about that? What was it about Naples, do you think, that brought out? Well, first talk about the writing of the book and the quality of the book. But why? What do you think Naples was particularly sort of responsible for?
Right, well, I think a slight advance warning of that question, thank goodness. And I think there are really three and a half reasons why it will be a great classic forever and why he was interested in Naples. Number one, the most obvious, was he was a writer of genius. And clever people aren't necessarily writers of genius. It's, let's face it, inherent. Ted Heath would never have been a great disco dancer. And I've written any amount of travel articles, and I've never written a page as good as Norman Lewis. That's obvious. And number two, I think, is an important thing. I can think of a reputed living travel writer who's an exceptionally skillful writer, writes the most beautiful prose, and I've heard Norman himself admire it. But, and I'm never going to say who this is, but in 100 years he will not be read, and Norman will. And I think the reason for this is that the personality is Norman did have soul. You know, there is soul in all his writing, you know. He was a magnificent personality. One of his great, he was a tremendous fan of Lorca, the poet. And I think, and Lorca wrote a whole short book on duende. And I think there is some duende and soul in Norman's writing that is lacking in other people. And in one way, specifically to answer the question, I think only way I can pull rank here probably is having read a zillion travel books for when I did Eland. And when I found a good book by an author that did Eland, obviously I read all the other authors' works in the hope that I'd find something. And I think with a classic, it's a bit like the fruit machine in the bottom of the Polish Club. You've got to get the 3 lemons in a row. So you've got to get good writing. You've got to have some soul. The person must have something there, compassion or whatever. And the third thing, I think, which is a bit intangible, but very, very, very often with great books, I found they'd only ever did one that would become a classic, which I published, is it's got to come at the right time in the person's life. And also, it's got to be a subject they are passionate about. And of course, Norman absolutely loved the exotic. Well, I don't know if it was his sentence, but somebody said about Naples, it may have been Norman, that it's the only European city without, only Oriental city without a European quarter. And of course, that appealed to Norman tremendously, and he had this great, great, great love of the exotic. So I think that happened at the right time. And the final point I'd make on that, which is something that I can't explain, I think quite often with the great classics, well, I'll start again, it's very rare that a publisher and an author get together, scratch their head, and they go off somewhere to write a book. It's very, very, very rare that that will become a classic. And very often with the great classics, if you could think of maybe Out of Africa, or Wilfred Thesiger's The Arabian Sands, they were written a long time afterwards, and they didn't do it for a book. Norman was not in Naples for a book. He is unusual in that he has written 6 great books, which, you know, on the travel line or related travel, which I think is unusual. But it's a book that will always remain a classic.
And the book was written there, was it? I mean, their diary entries.
Yes, he discovered later, in apparently absolutely minute writing, he did keep a diary. But he, you know, we're talking about decades later that he wrote it.
I mean, Charlotte, as a documentary maker, knowing so much about television, did it surprise you that Naples 44 has taken so long to come to the screen?
Yeah, I think it is, but I think, you know, I've had a sneak preview of the film, and I think the archive in this is absolutely extraordinary, because, of course, to capture some of the scenes that Norman was really describing is quite hard to do in a documentary. Unless you have what I think they've done an amazing job of finding archive from that period, which really brings it to life. So the thing about Norman's writing is the detail of every scene, in sometimes in the smallest bit of detail that most of us would miss. And I think that was the one of the things I travelled with Norman when he was in his 80s, but his absolute continued thirst and curiosity for the world and wanting to know more and wanting to explore is what he never stopped noticing the detail.
When
the
he
things
was
that
with
he
you,
noticed. That,
was he writing things down?
Yes,
Did he have a notebook?
Yes, he would always jot down in those tiny little notebooks with a pencil, always in pencil.
And he never wrote a sentence that wouldn't have a detail. There's no sentence that's a filler.
No.
There's just a connector.
Right.
Did the writing come easily to him, do you think? I mean, it flows so well, and it seems as though every word is perfectly balanced.
He was before the he's not a digital native at all, and he wrote and then Leslie typed for him, and then he took the scissors to the typed draft, and he glued bits back to front and on top of each other, and
that's encouraging.
And it turned into sort of a book of hours. You know, it was sort of the deeply thick parchments of overlaid text that worked on all through.
Was he quite? I mean, it seems one thing about his work is that he was indignant. He was angry about injustice, particularly particularly the way tribes were treated and the way,
Yes, he was.
way of life was just being destroyed. I mean, his work in Brazil really changed things. He said, look, you can't destroy these people's way of life just to sell their land. And that's how...
He said to me, he was writing a piece about Guatemala, and he showed it to me. He said, I'd like to know what you think. And then he said, I've no doubt that a slightly evangelical air hangs over it all. And he said, but you will have noticed that this is about a massacre, and I have only used the word massacre once. And he said, and I've made sure that I've only used the word massacre once. He'd taken all the other, and this is in complete contrast to other writers about injustice who may wax very indignant. But Norman drew his power from understating but giving you the detail and working up the impact so that when he used the word, he just dropped it. He was a fantastic composer of prose.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, I mean, like a musician, he's a really fantastic composer.
We're getting...
That indignation, didn't it? It was sort of mixed with humour at times, because he'd sort of see humour in things that you wouldn't. And then he was absolutely driven by this kind of desire to sort of show the injustice in the world. And, you know, that's why the trip in Indonesia was, you know, he really wanted to show things which he felt other people had not seen, because he thought by showing it, we might actually be able to stop it. And he really sort of made us question that we think of this as progress, but actually it's not progress.
And of course, I think that the Sunday Times articles, John, that he wrote, they had real impact, didn't they? I mean,
oh, goodness,
he wasn't, I mean, we talk of him as being a modest,
Yeah.
understated man, but they were big.
Yeah.
They had Don McCullen's pictures. They were really sort of changed people's minds.
Yeah. Well, it was the longest article that the Sunday Times had ever published, and no chance of that happening again today.
Yeah.
And part of his beadiness, which is quite interesting, he was his own man. He got that, you know, the genesis of the longest article that the Sunday Times had ever published was he just spotted 3 lines in a newspaper, 3 or 4 lines, a very minor thing in the back of some newspaper. Julian would know this more than me. And he just spotted there's something dreadful going on there. And he was on a plane and went out there.
Yeah, he moved quite quickly. I mean, it seemed to sort of
and
bestride the world without any
He had
cut
a
off.
couple of editors. Peter Crookston is one who deserves a name check, because Norman would sort of invite him to lunch and just say, Peter, I want to do this. And Peter would say, tell me more. And then he would just send him, and that would be that. And that partnership was a brilliant partnership for several years.
As we come to the end, we're just going to see for a moment, just want to ask, apropos of that, do you think that kind of writing would be given space in the newspapers nowadays? I mean, it doesn't seem as though we have quite the same sort of space for that.
Not in England, it wouldn't. It might in America. The
Maybe in
New
America,
York Review
maybe
of Books
in the New
or
Yorker.
something. Yes, but there's nowhere in England that does anything like that anymore.
Sad. Charlotte, I just want to ask you a slightly mischievous question, but, you know, again, it's about television. Yes. Norman, I mean, there were very things about Norman. He was a great performer, great storyteller. He also had big glasses and a moustache. I mean, could he have been Alan Wicker? Do you think television... Did we miss out on Norman as a television star?
I would have loved to have made more films with Norman. He was a fantastic subject and presenter to kind of try and tell the story through him. But as I say, I don't think Norman had pretensions to be Michael Palin. I think I think Norman really was driven to tell those stories, and that whichever way anyone wanted to help him tell those stories was what he wanted to do. And that's why when we say understated, you're absolutely right. He was driven with a passion to get to places that people couldn't get to and tell stories that he thought, you know, would cause outrage and actually stop things happening that he thought was wrong.
If I can add
well, I certainly have. I just say I certainly have pretensions to be Norman Lewis. I know I never will be, but there you go.
I agree.
Yes.
If I just add a brief anecdote to back up what she said, is I had a part-time job as travel editor at Harper's, and I thought, well, it'd be marvellous to use Norman. I knew quite well, and he might do me a favour. So I rang up Norman and said, well, would you write for Harper's? And he said, well, I just might. And so I said, you know what a high-end magazine it is? And so I said, well, where would you like to go, Norman? He said, well, I'd like to go somewhere with extreme poverty, most vicious dictatorship, and, if possible, a very malignant strain of malaria.
Yeah. Well, this is why he would never have been Alan Wicker. Absolutely sure. Well, the time's nearly up. I just come back to you, Julian, as his biographer. Just if you can possibly sum up the legacy of the man whose work we're about to see on film?
I think in terms of the way the film has actually been made, what Norman has done is he's kind of taken the past of Naples, brought it to us in the present, made it a kind of an allegory or a model or a symbol of something. Every decade has its Naples. And the film, which I've also had a sneak preview of, it's like a treasure unearthed. And I think John is right. These books will be read. They're all in print. They've always all been in print since the 1950s. They've never been out of print. And they will stay in print because there is something musical and beguiling. He's like Scheherazade, really. He's a kind of modern Scheherazade. You don't want to execute him because you just want him to carry on telling you the next story the night after.
That's lovely. Well, he certainly is one of a kind, and now we're about to see the film, and I'm going to ask, thank you, John, Charlotte, Julian, thank you very, very much for being part of this pre-film panel. I'm now going to ask Francesca Barra, who is the producer of the film, who's going to come along and tell us about it.
First of all, I'd like to thank Justin and Nadia and everyone from Steps Travel who have put together and sponsored this evening. And I want to point out my producing partner, Davide Azzolini, who's come from Italy, who's just there. Thank you. I would also like to thank Leslie Lewis, who is in the house with her wonderful family, who have been so supportive of the project from day one. They're also, next to Davide there. I'd also like to welcome Ambassador Terracciano and the director Marco De Loglu of the Italian Cultural Institute, who have been very supportive